if I was teaching now, I think, and I was watching kids writing creatively, I think what I'd be trying to impart is just how enjoyable it is to observe. You know, to observe as much as anything else. Obviously, the teacher is more than just an observer, but it is so hugely enjoyable to observe. I remember a teaching colleague of mine said his greatest ambition was to try and achieve perfect silence in the classroom, and that he'd be able to sneak out down to the staff room, make a cup of coffee, come back, and no one would have known he wasn't there. And I think he was into his third decade of teaching, and he hadn't quite achieved it. He got halfway down the corridor. But if you allow for a certain amount of noise and shuffling, it is extraordinary sometimes when the kids become so engrossed in what they're doing as opposed to what they've been told to do, that it is almost like some form of total silence because they are so engrossed. And it is hugely enjoyable just to observe it. I think that's a big part of the whole thing, really. It's exhilarating.
I think one of the things when I was at school, which is probably, you and I were at school around the same time.
Yeah.
One of the things that bothered me during our English classes was that we were always analysing somebody else's work, and there was very little time given over to being creative yourself. And it used to infuriate me. You'd be sitting there and the teacher would say to you, "Why do you think the author has used this word here?" And I'd be thinking, probably because it's the only one they could think of. Do you know what I mean? But it was everything was always laden and layered with analysing and not reading for the joy of it so much. And that's what I missed, really. I think a lot of books for me were destroyed by having to analyse them and think about them and talk about them, as opposed to just saying, read that and enjoy it. And when I did read for pleasure, for just enjoyment, I always felt I was really fired up to write myself.
Yeah.
And I think, I can do this. But actually in our classroom at the time, there was no creative writing. There was no. Absolutely none.
It stopped
and the
in
idea
secondary
of
school.
doing your own thing was an anathema to them. It's like, we can't do that.
Yeah.
So what I enjoy most about the Fighting Words module is that exact thing that you're talking about, that children getting so engrossed in their own voice and coming up with their own idea and their own vision of what they want to write, as opposed to, oh, you should be following a rule book or you should be doing it a different way. I love that.
Yeah.
I talk to, when I talk to kids in primary schools, I'll always say, because you give a few round of applause afterwards, and I always can say give a round of applause for Namoon Shorey, because sometimes you don't realise till you're older in life how important a teacher has been to you. But sometimes, and maybe just thinking about it now, you realise actually sometimes as a teacher or as an adult you don't realise how important your moment might be for a kid. And I think of when I was 7 years old and we were asked to write a poem in school, and I put the poem up on the wall with all the other poems and we do some art with it. And I remember that being the exact moment that I went, that's what I want to do forever. And that's the only thing I've ever wanted to do, and it's the only thing I can just about do. I'm completely useless and everything else. But it's funny because, that one moment that just turned out to be the spark for me, and you don't know what that will be for a kid. And and we're talking about writing, but it might be, might be illustration, it might be some other kind of creative activity, whether it's music or whatever, that just is that moment that the child in the room goes, oh, this is my thing. And I think even as an adult, and when we visit schools and we visit libraries, you leave and you go off and you might do something else. And I know it's different as a teacher because you spend more time with the kids, but sometimes you don't know the impact you've had until, as a writer, you might find a year later, somebody will say that, your visit, they've been writing ever since we met them, or they've won a prize for writing, or they've been reading since you came into the school, or whatever. So I think it's that creativity that you're talking about.
One of the good things, in that whole, again, the Fighting Words kind of way of doing it, is that people who I would never have spoken up in class, never. You know, I'd sit there and I'd be thinking dark thoughts about everybody around me, but I would never have spoken up, you know. And but the thing about the fighting words thing is that it's very collaborative and it makes you speak up, and nobody laughs at you. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's what I was always terrified of. Somebody would laugh at me.
Yeah.
But because of the way it's structured and because of the whole collaborative nature of it, everybody's voice is equal, and people encourage each other. The kids all encourage each other to come up with the most bizarre things and the most imaginative things that they can. And I think that's the other little key. You know what you're talking about, this made me creative, or this not made me creative, but helped me to find the voice. It's that encouragement and that feeling that it's not just my teacher, but it's everybody around me is applauding me for thinking of a purple dragon. And you know, and that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I love that. I get great kick out of that, I have to say. Everybody suddenly, it's all real silent at first.
Yeah.
And then suddenly there's this one thing, and then there's a hubbub of noise. And that's, do you know what, Roddy, that's, you know, coming back to what you were saying about silence in the classroom. It's not silent.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
You know, everybody thinks that creativity has to be quiet, and of course there has to be the quiet part, but the inspiration and the imagination and all that, that's
Yeah.
not quiet.
No. It's great. And I think as a teacher, if I was still a teacher, what I'd really enjoy is getting to know another aspect of my students. It's a bit like, I remember you get to know a kid, boy or a girl, and then you'd see them outside playing football, and they'd be brilliant, you know, really, really brilliant. And you'd think, oh, I didn't realize that. And it's a lovely thing to see. The same with putting on a play in the school. A young one in the classroom who is just, you know, very nice, always has her homework done, diligent, pleasant, and she gets up on stage and she's absolutely hilarious, and it's an aspect of her that you didn't know was there. And I think looking at kids writing, it's a quieter version of that. I think it's the same thing, and I think it's hugely important, I think, that the teacher knows the student and the student knows that the teacher likes the student and appreciates the student. It's a colossal part of the job, I think, and encouraging them. I mean, I was encouraged by a teacher in primary school. He praised my work when I was 10. And I think it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that encouragement has sustained me ever since. It's a huge part of it, I think.
It is interesting, isn't it, that we're all thinking of the teacher or the
Yeah.
moment or whatever, because actually my English teacher in secondary school, and we did better in secondary school, or I felt I did better in secondary school than in primary school, but my English teacher was John B. Keane's sister-in-law.
All right.
And that gave her a certain kudos, because like if she said something, you kind of, well, you know, she's sort of famous, you know, she must know a bit about books. But I remember her vividly. She wore glasses and was missing one side of them, and they would always slip down her nose. And I felt that's what, you know, real writers should look like, that kind of thing. But I remember her marking one of my essays, and she said it was very emotionally mature.
Right.
And I was about 14 at the time.
Yeah.
And I had always felt that I was really stupid. Do you know, not stupid, but just, you know, I wasn't one of the cool gang. And then somebody saying I'm emotionally mature, and I thought, jeepers, you know, that's so interesting enough, that stuck with me. It didn't make me think I was going to be great as a writer, but it made me think, okay, I can think about things. I'm not really, you know, somebody that nobody ever wants to know. And so I think that those words of encouragement and those bits where you acknowledge what you're saying, Roddy, is that somebody can be good at different things.
Yeah.
It's just really, really important.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary too at that. So, I mean, the thing that's really struck me over the years, as maybe I hadn't appreciated before I started writing for children, is just how free they are with their imagination. And I think as an adult, you're constantly trying to find that freedom, and yet they have it there. And it's, I've grown to kind of see that they're a very pure version of us as humans, in that they have this kind of unfettered imagination. They don't put filters on it. They want to share it. And it's a brief window. And if you're a teacher in a primary school, you have them at an age that is a really, really particularly important age, because it is that brief window, which unfortunately, And I see it, it gets closed, that window closes and closes and closes, and for lots of different reasons. And I see it when I go to the UK, where they start secondary school a year earlier. And you can take the same children in primary school, 12-year-olds in a primary school in Ireland and 12-year-olds in a secondary school in the UK, and they're very different because things have closed in on them. Because
And is it because they're structured more?
the
Is that
structure
what-
has
yeah.
changed, the expectations have changed. They've gone from being in a school full of children to a school with young adults and adults in it. There are bearded men walking around in the school that they've just arrived in. And I just, so when you walk into a primary school, you're getting something that is always going to be special, and that because they're so free with what they have to offer, the first thing I always do is talk to them about what they like and what kind of things that they're enjoying and what they like to create, because you want as much time as possible to get that from them, because they want to give it to you, and every single one of them has their own voice, which we know. But unfortunately, as we get older, we don't express it as freely and we're not as open about it. But at that age, they want to tell you. And I just think it's something which, I think that creativity is that aspect that perhaps brings it out in the most. I mean, I know I'm slightly biased in that, but...
And I think with secondary school kids, it takes them a little while to trust the fact that they can write what they want to.
Yeah.
That they're free to write what they want. And they dive into it pretty quickly then, I think. They really do. And I find it myself, it's quite exhilarating, not just exhilarating and enjoyable, but inspiring. I do find after I've been with a group of secondary school kids that I go home quickly so I can do a bit of work myself. They really do dive into it, and they write the most extraordinary stuff, the most brilliant stuff. And there's nobody telling them, no, that's not grammatical, that's wrong. And it's just great. And of course, the further they go into it then, the more they own it, the more disciplined they become. And they want to make sure it's as good as it possibly can be,
Yeah, I think what's good, Roddy, is that they're not afraid of, like you said at the start, just putting it all down and mopping it up later. But they're allowed to do that.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of them, in some of the disciplines in school, it's you have to kind of keep getting it right, one thing after the other to make it work. Whereas with the written word, you can keep getting it wrong. You can, and wrong is not, but you're not saying exactly what you meant to say, but you keep going and keep going. And then I think one of the phrases you've used is you can go back up the page. You can go back and go, oh, hold on, I'll change this completely. This whole start, no, I'm going to turn that into something else.
Yeah.
And that's fine. And it's not that you've made a mistake. No. It's just that you've kind of went, I can do this a different way, and it's still going to be brilliant, And I think it's important to be able to learn that you can, the first thing you've written down is not necessarily the last thing that's going to be on the page.
No.
How do you find when you're with secondary school students then? Because the one trick for me is, as I said, I'm so used to the younger age group who are all hands up and they want to talk to you and they want to tell you what's happening. And unfortunately, there's a more, they become self-conscious as teenagers, and I know this as through my own experience at home as well, and they don't want to be the one who puts the hand up. They don't want to be the one who sometimes steps out. What I've always loved about Fighting Words is that it offers that very sort of lovely, safe environment for them to be creative among other creative kids. But how do you find kind of encouraging them to be
sometimes
creative?
when you're doing the little dialogue, and you're asking two people to volunteer, it's rare enough that you won't get two who aren't natural show people somehow or other, that are happy to stand up and actually very unhappy to be told to sit down again. The very first time we did it, and it was one of these great accidents, with a group of young women, early school leavers, who were very keen on writing a story. And we just sat them in front of the screen, because the screen was down anyway. This was in Fighting Words. And the screen was down anyway. There were about 10 of them. And they didn't really know how to go about starting. And one of us just said, well, why don't we write what you want to write up on the screen and you can all see it happening? And they said, we don't know how to do it. So I said, well, why don't two of you just start talking? You could get up and start talking. They said, we don't want to stand up. And I said, you don't have to stand up, you know. Whereas I think if it had been in school, you'd be like, come on, stand up, come on, up to the front. And they didn't have to stand up, and they started talking. And then the others started reacting to what was going on the screen. And when they stopped talking, they loved that their stuff was up on the screen, and they were all talking about making changes. And one of the women who had spoken said, I wouldn't say that. And somebody said, you did say that. Well, I want to change it. And that's when it became story writing.
Yeah.
I want to change it. In other words, they weren't stuck with what they'd said. They could change it and make it better and funnier and more interesting somehow. And that's where the model came from, really. It was just one of those great moments, really. And it just seemed it worked for them. It certainly did, because they were working on it for months.
It's the key thing, Roddy, isn't it? It's being able to change things and not be criticised for changing it, and being actually going, oh my God, that's better.
Yeah.
That's what's so exciting, and that's.
And if they're in the group,
inventive.
I think it's kind of reassuring for them. And if they're told, you know, if they want to volunteer, grand. If they don't, and they just want to sit back and laugh, grand. And the little safeties, like making sure that if they are creating characters, they don't use names of anybody who's in the room or anybody who might be involved in that particular group, so that it doesn't become distorted or a bit, you know, could become, I suppose, a bit nasty or whatever. Really
So it's
good.
kind of interesting, though, isn't it, that like the big thing that we're all agreed on is that you don't want a structure, and yet there is a kind of a structure. You know, there's a safety net.
It is a bit like writing itself, isn't it, really? It's open. It's a bit like, we're writers, we plan as we go, in a way.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, we shouldn't be ever allowed to perform surgery. No, I think I'll go this way now. Or design a house.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah.
But we do, as writers, lay the foundation, I think, for the house in a way. And I think what's great about it is that you can plan as you go, and that's where you're changing your mind.
Yeah,
Things
like
that.
what if I suddenly do
Whereas
this?
if you're in an exam situation and you're told you have to write something in an hour, you don't have the room to really write. That's the fact, isn't it? You can fill pages with words, but you don't really have the room to write properly.
One of my favourite stories from a transition year student, when I was working with one of them on the transition year, was they were a group from, I think they were Donamead or somewhere like that, and this girl wrote a story which was entirely set in Los Angeles, and the protagonist was this glossy woman lawyer who drove a Ferrari and stuff like that. And I was thinking, you know, you're always saying, write what you know. God, this is just brilliant. This girl, I mean, I said to her, did you ever go to Los Angeles? No. Do you want to drive a Ferrari? No, but she does.
Yeah.
Oh, how brilliant was that? It was just great. And it was like, it was obviously, well, obviously, but I think it was drawn from, you know, maybe some of the TV series and all of that sort of
Which is what you
sort
know.
of stuff. Exactly.
Yeah.
But it was just so completely away from this girl's life experience, completely. And yet the story was great, and your woman was this real ball-breaking lawyer woman. And it was, I loved it. It was great. And I loved her. She was great too, you know. And she said, yeah, I might be a lawyer myself someday. And it was kind of brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. But probably my favourite story of all of them, just because it was so completely different.
Yeah.
And it's funny, sometimes you get, again, you know, I found this only a couple of weeks ago where I talked to a group of transition year students, and like that, you had two who were kind of, you know, well, we'll do all the talking here. You know, I knew I could rely on them to answer all the questions. But when you're asking them, you ask a lot of them, you know, why do you struggle? Where do you find it difficult to come up with stories? And they say, well, I don't have any imagination, or I don't know, I'm not very creative, which you know isn't true, because they were creative 5 years ago or 6 years ago when they were younger, and it's all still in there. It's just that maybe for whatever reason they've decided, or you know, sometimes the structure of the curriculum might feel like that's being squeezed out of them. But the other thing is that they're so soaked in creativity. I mean, one of the reasons maybe why they feel confident writing about a lawyer in San Francisco is they have all the world's films in front of them. They have all the world's TV shows. They have all the world's music. They're tapped into so much that they are feeding off that in some way or other.
And there are two things that have intrigued me as well. And I really found it very encouraging, in that, we're told that they're welded to their phones, largely by adults who are also welded to their phones. But when they start, and of necessity, if they're writing a story that's set in the present day, they all have phones, and there's a lot of texting back and forth. And they realize quite quickly as they're writing and they begin to edit that actually texting doesn't look good on the page. When you're trying to capture it on the page and you've got too much, say, italics, you begin to kind of list to the side as you're reading. And they really bring it down to the bare minimum. And it's really good. They don't allow it to interfere with telling a good story. In fact, it becomes quite useful because they are moving around and, the characters I'm talking about now, moving around and transferring information, and, the structure of the thing is dependent on the phone somehow. But they never let the phone dominate in a way, because they do understand what a good story is to read as opposed to watch. And I think that really intrigued me and encouraged me, because, this notion that, and it's every generation is accused by the previous generation of having the attention span of a goldfish, I seem to remember being told that myself in 1972, when goldfishes, mind you, back then, had a much longer memory span than they do now.
They've spent too much on their phones.
And the other thing that really just struck me just now was I worked with, when I say I worked, I watched 24 boys, young men, transition year from a rugby school, starting their stories, I remember, and they were very self-conscious at first. They weren't altogether comfortable. And my worry in a way was that we were going to have 24 stories about rugby, which is totally valid, but not something I personally would have been looking forward to. And we didn't get one. And actually, of the 24, if I'm remembering right, 6 were written from the point of view of women. Wow. I'd never, ever have guessed that was going to happen. But as they became aware, in a lived way, that they could do what they wanted to do, a lot of them threw what they had been working in the first week or two into the bin and started doing what they wanted to do. And 4 of them, at least 6 of them, I think, it was about a quarter of them, wrote from the point of view of women. And there were other surprises, stories you'd never expect from, it's so easy to make cliches of these young boys because of the school and the background they come from, and yet they got their elbows and pushed the cliches away, and it was a joy to watch. It took a while to get going, but again, it was a question of letting it happen. Stand back, let it happen. Their teacher knew who they were, and he stood back and let them. He believed in them. It was great.